gonna, thank you, Hadia. Before we get to hear from you, I just first want you to just take a deep breath and let it go just a little bit. I might have done a few other exercises to bring you back into the room, because don't you feel like you end up getting really into a little community, and it's sort of like, why is she taking me out of my community? Why is she calling me back? We're happy right where we are. Forget you. No. So before we get to that, I just wanted to explain this process and why we use it and why it's so important. It doesn't matter what kind of situation we're in. Everybody comes to the room, not just with a story, but with a certain level of what I call either indigenous technology or lived experience, right? That your expertise comes from who you are, where you've been, what you do, and what you know. And that any and every time we get together, we should take some time, even if it's just a few minutes, to share that with somebody else. Because those ideas are either in somebody else's head or were the same ideas that they've been looking for, and you were the one to bring it. So it's always extremely important for us to take just a little bit of time to experience each other whenever we're doing some of these kinds of workshops and sessions. Now, the other part about that, too, is that it's also, especially for the women we work with, because they may come in frustrated because, you know, the child got to school late that morning, and you know, they're the most antagonistic person in the room at that point. They're going off on everybody. They're very impatient. And if you just take a minute to get the story out, you find out that it had nothing to do with getting the kid to school late, but it actually had to do with being cussed out by the husband, or found out that somebody was cheating, or being hurt in some way, or being re-stimulated by a past trauma or by a past pain that you might not even know that that's what's causing you to be so irritable and anxious in that moment. And so it's also a way to really help folks move stuff out of the way so that we can really focus on what we're talking about in the room. In this instance, it was an opportunity to really share more expertise than just the 2 or 3 people you'll hear from on a given panel, but it's also because it empowers the story that you came into this room with. And even if I didn't hear everybody's story, I want to say thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your story, because it enriches somebody else's story. So, having said that, I just want to ask some questions. We'll come around to different groups of what you want to share. What you don't want to share from that group is fine too. But what you want to share that struck you in terms of the conversation about what was similar and what was distinct from what we, Mabel and I, have shared. And some of the things that you do. We want to hear that too. If you heard some really super, this is one of my favorite words, really super soul sonic, fabulous, exciting, inspiring thing come from another speaker, share that and what that did for you. Okay, so we're just going to take a few comments from each group. Is that okay? Are we together?
Yeah.
Just checking. I just want to make sure. I did. I have one last thought, though, from earlier that Mabel, you had actually pointed out and asked me, and it was about that whole distinction between the black-white divide in South Africa. I think it's important, because I don't think people focus on this either, to recognize that let's not even focus on where the countries are majority African descent. Okay, let's set that aside, because we already know that where HIV and women's inequality exists in those countries, that is predominantly black women. That's a given. But I don't know if people know that if you look at the global data that's aggregated in countries, because the WHO doesn't collect it this way, the UN does not report it this way, but in country you can find out this way. The same way I talked earlier today about if Black America, if all the black people in the United States were their own country, we were our own country, we would have the 16th highest prevalence of HIV of all countries in the world. And we are, like I said earlier in a session, black people in total are about 12% of the entire population and over 60% of the epidemic. You could look in Great Britain, you could look in Sweden, you could look in the Netherlands, you could look in Russia, you could look at any place where black folks live in that country. Even though they are the minority, they are the dominant burden of HIV and AIDS in every single country. And so You're going to tell me it has nothing to do with race? I think we need to examine that a little differently. No matter how race manifests in different places, because I know it's different than it is here. I know that. But it does manifest. And however it manifests itself, there's something to be said and seen about the plight of people of African descent around this world dealing with HIV and the many different forms of violence. So I just wanted to make sure that was out there so that it didn't just sound like it was the U.S., but that it really is. There has a root in the fact that people of African descent around the world are more vulnerable. So I just wanted to make sure I laid that out. All right, so which group? Anybody know? Or is there a volunteer? Group 4. You want to share some similarities or distinctions or just what you heard that struck you, inspired you, shocked you, moved you? Anyone?
Okay, I'll move. We all told our stories, and as always happens, my name is Paula Donovan, and I work for AIDS Free World, which is an advocacy organization that does international work. And as in every conversation everywhere about HIV/AIDS, none of us talked about race. So here we were all drawn to this session because it was about things that we talk about normally, which are HIV/AIDS and sexual violence, but none of us discussed race. And you know, I have a million questions about, as you do, as everybody does. You know,
right.
Why is? But I never sort of get to the theories.
Yes.
Nobody ever really sort of pinpoints exactly what the theories are. There are the great theories of, you know, the colonial powers moved into Black Africa and said, do it our way, and that screwed things up socially to the extent that, you know, all personal relationships were completely destroyed for the rest of time, and now it's manifesting itself. But we just never really get to swap ideas. I've never really even heard, maybe somebody here in the room does, whether or not anybody's doing any scientific studies. I mean, there is sickle cell anemia that affects only people from Africa and African descent. Is there something?
Yes.
You know,
yeah, there's a lot out there that's looking at the genetic dynamics, and there are some really interesting things that are coming out of that. Particularly, the research field is looking at treatment, are coming up with a lot of interesting things that I think, how do I want to say it, just like people don't talk about it, it's, you know, there are about 9 elephants in that room, right? So it's that big thing. And I've actually been in a situation where we're meeting with one of the pharmaceuticals that's, you know, creating one of these drugs that's supposed to focus on the entry inhibitors, right? And what they learn is that the certain genes are different for people who are more vulnerable for HIV than people who are not vulnerable, and most of those people live below, not the equator, but below at least the European divide, right? So there's a lot of questions that they're still working on, but yeah, there are some scientific things going on, but there's also a lot of social research that's going on. There's a lot of work, at least in this country that I know of, around what we has actually been coined as a theory, but also, you know, we talk about it just in our own, you know, very informal circles around, you know, there's post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, there's a thinking and there's a notion that there is such a condition as post-slavery stress, and that it's intergenerational, and that there are things that our ancestors experienced that are still lived out in their families post-slavery and post-Jim Crow. And so a lot of those same ideas, attitudes, behaviors, and culture and things we accepted as tradition are still a part of who we are. And that, you know, similar to when I work in South Africa, I think about the mental health issues that have not been addressed in the post-apartheid era.